Good evening, everybody. Before we start the formal part of the proceedings tonight, just a little warning, we are live streaming, so if you'd prefer not to be on camera, you may want to move to the back chairs. You probably won't be on camera, but just in case that's a concern for you. My tie is straight. Okay. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather tonight is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Good evening. My name is Vincent Kazmersky. I'm the chair of the Department of Law and Legal Studies here at Carleton University. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Chet Mitchell Lecture, our department's signature lecture series. The Chet Mitchell Lecture is named for a colleague in our department who passed away in 1991 at the tender age of 42. Chet had a profound impact despite the fact that he was a member of our department for only 7 years before passing away. He was a popular and enthusiastic instructor in a number of areas, most notably criminal law and medical legal issues. His areas of research were eclectic, but he had a remarkable ability to bridge and connect ideas, theories, and examples, much like our speaker tonight. Chet contributed to the administrative life of the department and enriched many a conversation with lively debate. A colleague commented at the time of his death that Chet's warm and generous spirit, his kind and inquisitive nature, and his keen and challenging intellect will be greatly missed with the department by his students and all who knew him. To honor Chet's legacy, every year we invite public figures, jurists, and academics who share his passion and generous spirit and who engage with issues in legal studies and social justice to deliver the Chet Mitchell Lecture. Which brings me to our speaker tonight. I'm so pleased to introduce Leilani Farha, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, as this semester's Chet Mitchell Lecturer. Leilani is a remarkable example of someone who is interdisciplinary at heart and who has combined her legal education with pragmatic and passionate activism to work for substantive change on the ground, in addition to formal change in the laws. This is truly remarkable when one recognizes that she does this without ever having gained a degree from Carleton. She has an honors BA in English literature, an MA in social work, and an LLB, all from the University of Toronto. After graduating from law school, she worked at the Centre on Housing Rights and Evictions in Geneva, then as the executive director of the Centre for Equality Rights in Accommodation, and most recently as the executive director of Canada Without Poverty since 2012. I'll pause here to note that Canada Without Poverty, under her leadership, won a key victory at the Supreme Court of Canada, challenging restrictions on political activity by Canadian charities as an unjustifiable infringement on their freedom of expression. Now, this ruling only came out in July 2018, but I still think that we can say, take that, Stephen Harper. Looking back at Leilani's career, it appears to me that the key turning point came in 2007, when she spent a year as the Community Leadership in Justice Fellow here at Carleton University's Human Rights Program. I knew there was some little bit of Carleton in her. But really, what has she done for us lately? Well, in her role as UN Special Rapporteur since 2014, Leilani has presented reports to the UN on homelessness and the treatment of housing as a commodity and its consequences for people who are poor and as well as middle class. She has recently issued reports to guide states and actors in meeting their commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals. under the Sustainable Development Goals. She's traveled to India, Egypt, Chile, and Portugal, among other places, to investigate whether governments are meeting their human rights obligations with respect to housing. She's now launched a new initiative called The Shift, a global movement which calls for everyone to approach housing as a human right, not a commodity. Leilani was awarded an honorary doctorate by Mount St. Vincent University in 2015, which is known as a Doctor of Humane Letters, although I'm not sure her letters to corporations are always humane, in recognition of her work, as well as the Barbara Schiffer Award in 2013 for her commitment to advancing women's rights. So you can see why it's such a great honor for us to have Leilani present our Chet Mitchell Memorial Lecture tonight. Please join me in welcoming the Executive Director of Canada Without Poverty and the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, Leilani Farha.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the weather gods for providing clear skies tonight so that we could traverse the city and gather to talk about what I think is one of the most pressing issues that cities are grappling with around the globe. I'd also like to thank the Department of Law and Legal Studies and my friend and colleague Vince for making this lecture happen, twice actually. This is my topic of choice these days, and I'm excited to have this conversation here in my hometown, which I don't often get to do. And I want to do a little unusual thing, which is I want to give a shout out and a big thanks to my parents, both of whom are in the room tonight. They have encouraged me from when I was this high to use my voice for social change, and I am forever indebted. Now, some of you will know that about 2.5 years ago, I was approached by an award-winning documentary filmmaker named Frederick Carleton, who was interested in making a film about the corporate capture of housing and what's happening in cities across the world. I was keen to try to use this new medium for me for the messages that I will convey tonight. So, for the last 2 years, I was followed around by a documentary film crew. The film, called Push, will have its world premiere in Copenhagen at the end of March, and hopefully will be screened at the Toronto Hot Docs Fest in April or May. My sense is that the release of the film might be the start of something important. And so I thought I'd start my speech tonight with a sneak peek for all of you. Where is this cursor? Oh, sorry, I'm a Mac user. There we go.
Y no, ellos, como inmobiliaria no nos han pedido permiso. Y volaron todos los árboles, no hay nada. El parque varón, la palabra parque es cero.
A new owner came and took possession of the building. They were breaking locks for the main entrance for the building. They were physically pushing their way into people's apartments upstairs.
I hear stories of nurses and doctors and police officers and firefighters who are unable to afford to live in the city where they're supposed to be guarding and helping. I'm giving you this notice because I want to end your tenancy.
They came after her with the hardest category they could.
The neighborhood's getting gentrified, it's moving, it's come right up to King and Dufferin, and it's only one direction into our neighbor, and we're in the way.
When I hear people today saying it's gentrification, one reaction, an ironic reaction, is, if only. It's much deeper than that.
Housing has become overly financialized, so it's like gold. But gold is not a human right. Housing is.
They want to raise each apartment, they build a window to like $900 each. If it goes to $3,400, I have to make at least $100,000 a year.
Schools are closing down in areas where there's a concentration of vacant housing. Shops are closing down, restaurants are closing down. You lose the diversity and the richness of a city.
These dark, empty buildings, and they are making money.
So when people think, oh, poor investor, something went wrong, hell no.
One of the council said, if you can't live in Notting Hill, then you shouldn't be in Notting Hill. What's all that about? Who the fuck is he to say something like that?
Preparing for a meeting with the largest landlord in the US, what questions would you have the special rapporteur ask, depending on who I meet there?
You might want to go big picture, ask them what they think their obligation is as a corporate citizen.
If I can get them to talk about the human side of this, then we might get somewhere. They canceled the meeting.
Oh, shit.
Are you a legal scholar actually on human rights, or is you just
Yes,
looking?
yes,
So
that's right.
You have the instrumentality that is the law.
Exactly, because what I see is those with power work and they deploy the law in ways that work for them. Stuff is happening, you know?
Stuff is happening indeed. Many years ago, I met a woman in New Orleans named Naomi. This was in the aftermath of Katrina, the big hurricane that opened the levees and caused massive flooding. I met Naomi outside of her destroyed home. She was African American. Should I take it off?
No, keep it
Yeah.
on for a second, I'll check.
She was African American in her 60s, physically disabled, using a wheelchair. Naomi wanted to show me her home. It was a small white bungalow structure with steps leading up to her front door. I offered to help her get up the stairs, but she refused, telling me she wanted me to see her daily reality. She hoisted herself out of her wheelchair and proceeded to drag herself with some effort up the front porch and then into the front hallway of her home. It was about 45 degrees in the house, and there were bugs swarming around us, so much so I couldn't even take notes for swatting them away. Her floorboards were torn up, and I could see down to the foundation of the home. There was no working toilet. In fact, there was no running water. She was using a dry toilet and then carting away the refuse when she could. It was, in my opinion, hell. After Naomi told me her story, I asked her how she felt living in the richest country in the world in these conditions. Naomi looked at me, and without skipping a beat, she said, "Abandoned." This sense of abandonment is something I hear repeatedly. The idea that if you're poor and homeless, you don't count. You're invisible. In some instances, not treated as a human being. I have heard it countless times everywhere I go. I have heard it here in Canada from my board of directors who live in poverty, from the many women I have spoken to living in shelters, and recently by residents from part of Herongate, a mostly racialized community of 500 or so in Ottawa who've been displaced, and many of whom faced homelessness. The question is, how did we get here? Or, as I rather ineloquently said after spending 10 days looking at homelessness in San Francisco and LA, how the fuck did we get here? A comment that, needless to say, got picked up in the media. Don't tweet it. Naomi's words have long reverberated in my head. Abandoned. Abandoned by whom exactly? She had a community of support. That was obvious to me. Family members, friends, community workers hauling water to her house, helping her get to doctor's appointments, helping her to find food. No, by abandoned, she meant her government had abandoned her. And she is right. Governments the world over have abandoned their responsibility for housing. Let's remember, worldwide there are at least 100 million people living in the streets, facing daily threats to life and security. And this number is on the rise. Approximately 1.6 billion people lack access to an adequate home, living in informal settlements or encampments, under the constant threat of being evicted or swept up. Many lacking clean water and sanitation, requirements of the right to adequate housing. In North America and across Europe, homelessness is increasing in every country except Finland. In many places, the government response to homelessness is to criminalize and stigmatize people for sitting or standing in one spot, or for carrying out activities necessary for human survival, like eating and sleeping. In many places, homelessness is directly related to the unaffordability of housing. In cities across the world, including here in Canada, housing costs are skyrocketing and not at all commensurate with incomes, making it impossible for moderate and low-income residents to manage. In the Greater Toronto Area, for example, in the last 30 years, housing prices have increased by 425%, whereas in a similar period, average family income has only grown by 133%. In other words, housing prices have increased at 3 times the rate of income. Even outside of Canada's largest cities, we see this phenomenon. In Hamilton, for example, rents are increasing at higher than provincial averages, and there has been a sharp rise in applications for eviction, an increase of 95% in a 6-year period. In Ottawa, those working in the real estate sector have reported the same thing. The president of the Ottawa Real Estate Investors Organization said at the start of this year, quote, "For a 2-bedroom, the average rent rose by its highest level in 15 years in the last year. And real estate agents have noted up to a 15% increase or so in the average cost of rental apartments on the market in Ottawa between 2017 and 2018. You can bet that most renters in the city didn't see a 15% rise in their household income. We know in this country that renters spend a greater portion of their income on housing than do homeowners. And it is always the most vulnerable that are most affected. Indigenous peoples who have historically and continue to be forced off their lands and are subject to practices of colonialism. Persons with disabilities who are either institutionalized or deinstitutionalized, often without adequate supports. Immigrants and recent migrants who are often low income and considered less deserving of public support as newcomers. Women and youth leaving violent households with nowhere to go. LGBTQ and others facing some of the harshest forms of discrimination, and so on. The experience is the same. People are being pushed out of their homes, out of their neighborhoods, and out of their communities. In my opinion, all of this is testament to Naomi's claim, and the claim of so many others, of government abandonment. In particular, their abandonment of a commitment to human rights. So again, how did we get here? I think in Canada, the generally accepted narrative within the housing sector is that in the 1990s, the federal government walked away from housing in any meaningful way. They ceased funding any new social housing while dismantling other social protections and untying social transfers, resulting in the development and rapid rise of homelessness and housing inadequacy and insecurity, along with other social phenomenon like the opening of food banks, all of which is, of course, ongoing today. But this doesn't really explain, in my opinion, the why, the root causes of the here and now. No, I think the root causes lie in an ideology that was promulgated in the 1980s in this country, and that really took hold by the end of the 1980s under Prime Minister Mulroney, and then that became our dominant paradigm in the 1990s and continues well until today. And that dominant paradigm that I'm talking about is neoliberalism. And I admit that when I articulate the problem as rooted in neoliberalism, I feel slightly self-conscious. I worry that I come off sounding like a typical and predictable lefty, and thus that I will be dismissed. But as Special Rapporteur, I've had the unfortunate opportunity to get up close and personal with neoliberalism. I have seen it in action in Chile, whose economy, including the housing sector, is based in Milton Friedman's neoliberalism. And I have seen it in agreements between the International Monetary Fund and many countries like Egypt and Portugal, for example, that have had austerity measures imposed on them. As it happens, back in the 1990s, when Canada's Finance Minister Paul Martin was taking decisions to de-invest in social housing and slashing social programs, he was doing so on the advice of the very same IMF. And that's exactly what neoliberalism is about. It's an ideology that believes the unregulated market will take care of, well, everything, and that governments should take a big step back from social protections and supports. In the housing sector, it means reducing protections for tenants and making sure housing is wide open to the unregulated market. Now, in the 1990s and early 2000s, neoliberalism looked pretty bad. Many of us, you'll recall, took to the streets. Some of us were students and activists to protest globalization, a particular manifestation of neoliberal policies that gave multinational corporations unregulated political power through trade agreements and deregulated financial markets. But when you take neoliberalism, or the neoliberal system in which we're currently living, and you add the financialization of housing to it, well, it creates, in my opinion, the impossible and unsustainable housing conditions we're experiencing in cities around the world, including many of our own here, Vancouver, Toronto, Hamilton, even Ottawa. And by financialization, I mean where housing is viewed as a commodity or a place to park excess capital, where housing is treated as a financial instrument rather than home. Of course, housing has long been financialized. We've had a mortgage-based housing system in place in Canada for a long time. 68% of our population are homeowners. Mortgages are, of course, financial products linked to housing. But that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about financialization. I'm talking about something very new. There is unprecedented wealth in the world right now, and a lot of that wealth is being parked in housing, used as an instrument to leverage capital and grow profit. Sophisticated financial instruments have turned housing into a very lucrative stock, resulting in uber profits for some and driving up rents and reducing the availability of affordable units for others. Housing is now invaded by financial actors, banks, pension funds, private equity firms, real estate investment trusts, shareholders, and rich individuals, all of whom view housing predominantly as a place to park excess capital, of which there is an abundance, and to turn a profit. Few of whom view housing as home. They are buying up properties, particularly in neighborhoods they call undervalued, where affordable units still exist. Properties out of which they know they can squeeze more profits. Ontario's market is dominated by a few large corporate actors in residential real estate, which creates monopolistic markets, almost like price fixing. Ottawa's Heron Gate in the East End is an example. And I think there are some Heron Gate folks here who may speak later. Haringey is one of Ottawa's most diverse communities, home to a large number of residents from Somali and Arab backgrounds. It comprises a mix of townhouses, medium-sized buildings, and tall apartment towers. In late May of 2018, the landlord, Timber Creek Communities, a multi-billion-dollar asset management firm, bought up large swaths of the community. Timber Creek had bought the properties about 5 years ago, or maybe more than 5 years ago. In May 2018, they announced plans to demolish 150 affordable units in that neighborhood. Haringey Tenants Coalition has said this may be the single largest displacement of tenants in Canada's history. Timber Creek, which operates in 27 cities across Canada, as well as in other countries and cities, including New York and Hong Kong, said the townhouses are no longer viable and gave the tenants eviction notices. In the face of the eviction and possible homelessness, one of the residents, Binto Mohammed, said, "There's a piece of me missing because of the stress." When Timber Creek rebuilds the community, there is no certainty that the units will be affordable and that residents will be able to return. Another of the big players in the residential real estate market in Canada are real estate investment trusts, REITs. A REIT is an alternative corporate structure that groups properties together and then allows for everyday investment in the holdings. And those apartment units are put on the stock market. In the financial world, they say a REIT is a way for everyday people to buy real estate without having to view a property. You can just buy some stocks. So you might be living in an apartment in Ottawa and your landlord might be a shareholder in Vancouver. And that shareholder likely has no clue that they're your landlord. And let's be clear, for REITs, the client is not the tenant of the apartment building. The client is the investor. So the REIT that owns your building is not concerned with you as a tenant. Their preoccupation is with ensuring their investors get a good return on their investment. And where does the return come from? The income stream generated through rents. So when you hear about renovictions, whether here in Ottawa or in Toronto or Vancouver, often it has little to do with upgrading housing. In a way, renoviction is a misnomer. It's really about upgrading dividends. This, what I've just described, is the new housing landscape. There are unprecedented amounts of capital flowing into residential real estate, and these actors have more power and quick money at their disposal than do governments. It gives them political leverage and advantages in accessing land, for example. There are, of course, other manifestations of the financialization of housing. There are, individuals of ultra high net worth, as they're called, who park excess capital in real estate with no intention of living there. This is the phenomenon that was reported a few years ago in Vancouver and other hedge cities like London and Sydney. The new financialization of housing is also made possible through short-term rental platforms like Airbnb and HomeAway, and now even Expedia and Bookings.com, which result in the increase of the development of luxury accommodations and the reduction of available housing stock that could be used for affordable rentals. In January of this year, it was reported that Airbnb had drained Toronto of 6,500 units that could have been on the long-term rental market. The impact of all of this is that people are being pushed out. Rents are rising, people are being evicted in greater numbers, and sometimes falling into homelessness. Existing stock is deteriorating. New stock is luxury or high-end and for investors, not tenants. And with no social safety net, people have nowhere to turn. And so where are governments in all of this? All of this is happening quite legally through financial structures that governments themselves have helped to create and have failed to regulate. While governments have abandoned tenants and low-income residents, they certainly have not abandoned investors. And the importance of this relationship with investors cannot be underestimated. What we all need to get our heads around is that housing or residential real estate is now big business. In fact, it is the biggest business of all businesses, now valued at $163 trillion US dollars. And you should be shaking your head and saying you don't know what that means, because you don't know what that means. 163 trillion US dollars is almost 3 times the entire world's GDP. The entire world's GDP. In Canada, real estate drove 1/5 of our economy in 2017. It's not surprising then to learn that Reits, for example, receive, through government-created tax laws, special tax considerations in exchange for distributing the bulk of the cash flow to shareholders in the form of dividends. And Reits outperform pretty much every other asset class. So this is going to be protected by governments. Suffice to say, housing as a commodity is integral to the Canadian economy, to business, and to the financial worlds. So with this as the landscape, we now know what we are up against when we say we want to end homelessness and ensure access to adequate, affordable, and safe housing for everyone. Tinkering with social programs and policies is not going to cut it. We need more. I think it's important to note that the decision by governments to support housing as a commodity or an investment, and the complementary decisions to withdraw conceptually and in practice from housing as a social good, cannot and must not be regarded as just any old policy decision. As you heard me say in the film, housing is not gold. Gold is a commodity. Housing is not. It's a human right. A human right that governments around the world, including governments in Canada, have committed to. Unfortunately, this understanding of housing as a place to live in dignity, a place of warmth and security and love, of shared stories and memories, is losing its currency. I want to remind you that it hasn't always been this way, at least not in Canada. In the 60s and 70s, housing was viewed as providing personal security, but not necessarily wealth. Governments played an active role through legislation and policy in ensuring that a variety of housing options were available for diverse household incomes. Homeownership, rental accommodation, public or subsidized housing were all options. Homelessness and the unaffordability of housing as known now didn't really exist, and certainly not on today's scale. Without painting too rosy a picture, housing was generally, back then, understood as a social good. And in that way, it was aligned with the understanding that housing is a human right, a place to live in dignity. So how do we get back to that understanding and that vision? Well, I think what's required is a seismic, paradigmatic shift. And that's why, in partnership with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and a network of cities from around the world, I've launched a new multi-stakeholder global movement to reclaim the right to housing called The Shift. The movement understands that deprivations of the right to adequate housing are not just program failures or policy challenges, but are human rights violations of the highest order, depriving those affected of the most basic human rights to dignity, security, and to life itself. The Shift recognizes that housing can no longer be understood as a commodity or a place to grow wealth, but must be embraced as a social good necessary for the well-being of the individual and society alike. But more than anything, if we're going to solve homelessness and grossly inadequate housing in countries around the world, I think we need governments to show up. All levels of government, and they need to show up in ways they have long abandoned, and they need to show up in new ways to counter the very sophisticated and deeply entrenched causes of homelessness and inadequate housing. The Shift movement urges governments to adopt comprehensive human rights-based strategies on the basis that governments need to adopt a framework that will result in structural change, that will prevent homelessness as a priority first, and that will address barriers to adequate, affordable housing. So the Shift views, and I view, human rights as essential to this framework. Why? Ask yourself, all of you, what is homelessness? What is grossly inadequate housing? Like, what is it really at its essence? How do individuals and families experience evictions or stereotypes and stigmatization? The answer to all of those questions is that they are all an assault on dignity and life. They all challenge what it means to be human. These are human rights concerns, and they deserve human rights responses. Human rights change the way governments interact with people who are homeless and inadequately housed. They recognize them not as beneficiaries of charity, but rather as rights holders, active subjects, empowered to engage and be involved in decisions that affect their lives. A rights-based approach to housing clarifies who is accountable to whom. All levels of government are accountable to people, particularly marginalized and vulnerable groups. And this, in my opinion, is really important. It allows advocates to call on governments to tax corporations fairly and increase taxes on the rich. It allows you to do that because it provides you a framework to hold governments accountable to that demand. Human rights law provides the legal imperative. Governments have ratified international human rights treaties and have thus committed themselves to being accountable to human rights standards and obligations. Think of the difference it makes if you just call generally, oh, we should tax the rich more, we should tax corporations more. How do you hold a government accountable if you don't have a framework of accountability? That's what human rights offers. Human rights incorporate universal norms which bring coherence and coordination to multiple areas of law and policy through a common purpose and a shared set of values. They recognize the structural causes of housing disadvantage, and they propose structural solutions. Earlier this year, I presented a report, actually it was last year, I presented a report which outlines 10 principles that all rights-based rights-based housing strategies must have, whether adopted at the national or local level. I'm not going to go through all of them, but let me highlight just a few. Particular ones of relevance in the Canadian context. Housing strategies have to be based in law, and they have to affirm the right to housing as a legal right, where remedies are provided for violations of rights. This is what the Government of Canada is being asked to do right now, and what hopefully they will do. A legislated right to housing suggests governments are taking seriously the idea that housing is more than just a policy area, that it is a human right like other human rights that find legislative articulation. It need not just be national governments that legislate. Cities could start affirming the right to housing. They could symbolically ratify international treaties, for example. They could develop rights-based city charters that include the right to housing. They could develop mechanisms for ensuring that the right is progressively implemented at the local level. Strategies should ensure rights-based participation and be inclusive of the most vulnerable populations, no matter their place of origin. There is a significant difference between the type of pro forma consultation that governments often engage in. You know, check who's around the table. Oh, we have one poor person there, check. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about rights-based participation. It's important to ensure that processes are put in place to ensure meaningful engagement with persons with lived experience of homelessness and inadequate housing. They are experts in their own lives. I think about how differently things would have gone if the city had engaged with the residents of Herongate in a meaningful participatory process. If Herongate tenants were provided with the resources to investigate the quality of their own housing and to revision their own community amongst themselves. My experiences in other countries where these processes have been put into place is that people are creative and they are experts and they make only modest demands. A dignified life is what's demanded, not a luxurious life. Strategies must ensure access to justice, and this does not only mean access to courts. Whenever I talk about access to justice, everyone thinks, oh God, you want us to litigate this stuff? I'm talking about the ability for someone to go somewhere and claim their human right. And it doesn't have to be a court. It could be a tribunal. It could be an ombuds office. I don't think in other areas where rights are at stake, we're comfortable with only having policy options to address violations. If your freedom of religion is trampled on, or you experience state-sanctioned torture, and you want to seek redress, would you be satisfied if you were told, oh, we're working on a policy to address that? Our current policy just didn't get it right. Sit tight. Or would you expect in a country with strong human rights protections and institutions something more? Strategies should, of course, include human rights-based goals and timelines. That one's really nice and easy. You know, we will do X by X date. In this country, the government has committed to ending chronic homelessness by 2020. So that's a measurable goal and a timeline. It's not good enough for the 10th richest country in the world, but that's at least they've made that commitment. We'll say that. Strategies have to clarify the obligations of private actors and regulate financial, housing, and real estate markets. That's clear. The obligation to realize the right to housing lies with states and cannot be delegated to private actors. I think this is actually one of the most important points. If the Government of Canada decides it wants its housing needs of the country to be met by private actors, it can do so under international human rights law. But those private actors have to fulfill the government's human rights obligations. You can't contract out of your human rights obligations when you're a government. Strategy should include robust measures to reorient private investment and development to ensure inclusive cities and affordable housing. I think this was a really huge missed opportunity in the recent national housing strategy that the government put forward. There was nothing on the topic of financialization and regulating markets and real estate markets at all. 4 years ago, countries around the world, including Canada, committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs, as they're called, commit governments to ensuring access for all to safe, affordable, and adequate housing by 2030. Obviously, this means ending homelessness by 2030 and addressing housing affordability and inadequacy. With just 11 years to go, is that right? 11 years to go. If we're going to meet the goal of ensuring adequate housing for all by 2030, I have little doubt that we must all commit to making the shift. While governments need to shift to new rights-based approaches to housing, I think other sectors need to shift too. The housing and homelessness sector needs to start doing our work differently. I think that in Canada, it has to dramatically broaden its focus. It needs to be recognized that this is a different fight than we have had before, and that it's going to require different tools and different strategies. I have to say, save for some activists like, in my opinion, the Heron Gate Tenant Coalition, I am not sure the sector is there yet. We have to realize that it's not just about getting more money to flow to services and programs. It's not about how we provide services. It's not just about having social housing built. This is a structural fight, a reorientation of thinking and understanding, and from there, action. And what about lawyers and legal thinkers? There needs to be a shift there too. Professor Saskia Sassen, you heard her in the trailer, says so much of what is happening with respect to residential real estate, housing, and homelessness is related to how laws have been deployed to enable finance to move in and turn homes into financial instruments. We may very well need, therefore, law to undo this. I think as a lawyer, I'm allowed to say that we aren't always as creative as we can be. I don't think we try hard enough to use the law, which can be a sharp sword, to protect those who need protection. Perhaps law schools and university law programs may have a role to play. Resources could be harnessed, community relationships developed, so that professors and students can contribute their efforts in addressing housing disadvantage and rights violations in their own communities, including through advancing local strategic litigation cases, for example. The SHIFT movement already has a growing number of committed stakeholders. 32 cities from around the world have committed to reclaiming the right to housing. They have signed the Cities for Housing Declaration, and these cities include Amsterdam, Barcelona, Berlin, Montreal, Mexico City, Paris, Seoul. Geneva's next. Sweden, Malmö, Sweden will come on board soon. These cities are all committing to take action to reclaim housing as a human right through a variety of actions. Several national human rights institutions are coming on board in March, and we anticipate a sea of support coming from NGOs, community-based organizations, trade unions, and soon national legislators. In preparing for this talk, I did have a brainwave. Why wouldn't I recruit law schools or law professors and their students to join the shift. That is, any school or program within a school or any professor who is committed to teaching about the right to housing as a fundamental, justiciable human right. So, to get the ball rolling, I admit, I yelled upstairs to my partner, David Wiseman, who is a professor at Ottawa University in the law faculty and has been working with the Herongate folks. And he immediately agreed to be part of the shift. So perhaps someone else in this room will follow suit. You see, my sense is, honestly, that if we're going to make change, if we're going to make a shift and ensure the right to housing for all, we're going to need to come together in a new way and in a multi-stakeholder way to show these huge forces that we're up against, that we too have strength. We need to come together sector by sector with a consistent message delivered through actions. Housing is a human right that will not be sold to the highest bidder. We might all need to take a page from the Herongate Tenant Coalition and the multi-pronged approach they have taken. From community mobilizing to legal action to political advocacy to harnessing mainstream and social media to great effect, they have had that message loud and clear, and they've had their message heard. Recently, Timber Creek announced that their new build will include, supposedly, 20% affordable units, and they will abide by a social contract and a commitment that, quote, no further demolitions for occupied units will occur until impacted tenants are able to transfer their leases and relocate within the community to newly constructed units at the same rent. Let's see. If joining the shift in these ways isn't possible for you, there are small things, everyday things that you can do. Not so different from taking out the recycling, becoming a vegetarian, or flying less to decrease your carbon footprint. So here's my to-do list for you. Demand that your governments adopt rights-based housing strategies that recognize homelessness as an immediate priority. Host a public screening of Push, the film, and invite unlikely allies. Generate conversation and discussion. Start a pension fund campaign. Determine if your pension fund invests in residential real estate, including commercial Reits, and if they do, ask them not to. It's now common for employees to ask pension funds not to contribute to climate change through their investments. We need to start asking our investors to stop making investments in residential housing. And on a more personal level, when you see a homeless person, recognize that they are there on the street, likely as a result of the commodification of housing, and most assuredly as a result of the failure of governments to effectively implement the right to housing. And lastly, think twice before you rent an Airbnb on your next vacation. Find out if Airbnb or whatever short-term rental platform you're using is regulated in the city that you're visiting before you book. I guess what I'm asking you to do is to find your outrage. Don't accept the unacceptable. Push back. We have to stop government's abandonment of people and stop the abandonment of human rights. Thank you. I just need some water. Oh, water.
Thank you so much, Leilani, for a wonderful talk. We have time for questions. In order for the questions to get picked up by the live stream, I'm going to play a little Monty Hall, and I'll come around with a microphone. If you could stand and address your question to Leilani. If you would like, you could introduce yourself, but it's not necessary. You could also sit if that's more comfortable. So I'm open for business. Sure.
Hi, Leilani. Great presentation, first of all. Second of all, I just wanted to ask you a question about the marginalization. Sorry. That's okay. Of these LGBTQ and the indigenous people. So in terms of focusing more on a lens that includes them, how would you sort of go about trying to get them in the movement as well?
Do we want to take a few questions and then?
Why don't we do them one at a time?
One at a time? Okay. Well, then that doesn't give me time to think.
You're the boss, Sally.
No, it's good. It's good. Well, I think LGBTQ and Indigenous peoples are already part of housing movements. In fact, globally, certainly they are. Indigenous peoples have tended to articulate their claims slightly differently, right? They articulate often their claims as land claims. But for sure, in this country, for example, there's huge movement around the right to water for Indigenous peoples living on reserve without access to adequate water, for example, of which there are far too many. Of course, LGBTQ, it's a big movement now, and housing is has a part of that movement. Not enough, in my opinion. How to get people more engaged on housing? I'm trying to think of a new word for housing, because I think the word housing is like the most boring word in the world. I think people shut down. Honestly, I'm a housing person. I should know. People kind of shut down when you say the word housing. I think people think of bricks and mortar. I don't know what it is. It is a boring term. So we need to get people galvanized. I think the non-discrimination equality lens might work for those groups better, but yeah, I hope that helps.
Hi, sorry, that feels loud. So my name is Shriyanjita. I'm an MA student. That was a lovely presentation. Thank you. So my question's about how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? So all these countries are in it, and the thing is about how the neoliberal agenda has kind of usurped the human rights movement. So even if you have the human right movement to housing, right, and the right, my question is, what about equality? Because that issue still doesn't get resolved in that trope of human rights. So that's my question.
First, I want to make a distinction between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights treaties, just so people know, because not everyone will know. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is actually almost like a political document, in that there wasn't like a real ratification process. So it stands as kind of sort of like a political commitment, very serious and important political commitment. But at the same time, governments actually have signed and ratified very particular treaties that include all of the rights that are included in the UDHR. But there's a difference, because you can hold governments accountable to things they have ratified, and it's harder to hold governments accountable to political commitments. So it's just always important to make that distinction. In the case of Canada, for example, we've ratified all the big important international human rights treaties. And so we can hold Canada accountable to all of the rights that are contained in the UDHR, the Universal Declaration. I'm not sure I totally understood the second part of what you asked. You're totally right that neoliberalism has usurped to a huge degree human rights space, is what I would say. I think there has been a huge amount of conversation around inequality, not equality. Inequality. So we've taught, there are tomes written now about income inequality and disparity between the 1% and the 99%, right? So I actually find that language can be obfuscating where housing is concerned. Because one of the things I've discovered as I research more about financialization is that housing and really real estate is a real driver of income inequality. So the rich are getting richer whether it's a corporation or an individual, because of their attachment to real estate as an asset and the instruments that come out of housing as a financial instrument. And so housing is actually a driver of income inequality, but no one talks about it that way. So my work actually for the last few years has been trying to expose that we need to look at the particulars of inequality and then equality from there. But I don't know if that's getting at what you were, yeah.
Thank you, Leilani, very much for the lecture. I thank your mother because she got all of us to the lecture, but it was, I thank the family. Anyway, I like your lecture. I like what the issue you are raising. But now you are coming here to talk to the lawyers, the students, the law. But what about the social worker and the people working in the field of counseling and their role, especially in the issue of the Heron Gate residents? They should have dealt with the social aspect, the dimension of it. So there are other dimensions, the mental health, the job market, it is really is tangled. The issue is not only on the financial aspect and lawyer. It has to be a multi-integrated, I think. What do you think?
I think there are people from Herongate in the room, and so I don't want to speak on behalf of people from Herongate. But what I will say to your excellent point, I push all the structural stuff and financial stuff very much in all of my presentations and speeches, etc. I don't mean to discount the important role of social workers, healthcare providers, counselors, but that area of dealing with housing and inadequate housing and homelessness is well covered by other people. There are not so many of us talking about the structural stuff that I'm talking about. I'm, in fact, one of the few globally. And so I don't want to emphasize that stuff, but I do find it important. Recently, I was working with some folks in Los Angeles, and they've developed the city council has an advisory board. They have a huge homelessness problem in LA. The bulk of homeless people in the US, a disproportionate number live in California, both up north in San Francisco and in Los Angeles as well. And this group that I've been working with work on Skid Row, and it's, Skid Row's like hell on earth. And what they're trying to do is develop a human rights code of conduct for city officials who generally treat people on Skid Row and homeless people living on the streets like shit, excuse the expression. And so they're trying to develop a human rights code of conduct. So it goes to your point, I think, that there are ways of social workers doing human rights practice. And at the core of that is what I said already. It's treating people with dignity, recognizing people as rights holders and not that they're not asking for a handout or that they're just charity cases.
Hi, Leilani. Thank you for your fascinating and quite nerve-wracking talk. So my name is Alistair. I'm an engineering student out at UBC. Not entirely sure who let me in. And I sort of grew up between London, Sydney, and Vancouver, and so I've really experienced this sort of massive increase in housing and the displacement that has resulted firsthand. And an argument that I often hear from people living in these cities, so perhaps as a counterpoint to a lot of what you've been saying, is that as a part of sort of the houses getting very expensive, it generates an enormous amount of tax revenue for both municipal, provincial, and national governments, and it is an engine of economic growth, particularly in Canada. And this economic growth can sort of provide economic opportunities for people, which does often make people's lives better. And the tax revenue can fund social programs, which also help make people's lives better. And so people can be quite hostile to the idea of using policies to make housing cheaper or more affordable because they're worried about what that might do to government balance sheets. And so I'd be curious to know what you would have to say against such an argument.
It's such a good point, and it's so interesting when I travel around from country to country, especially when I'm on an official visit. What's one of my responsibilities. I go to 2 countries a year. I always ask to meet with the Ministry of Finance. They're always like, no, you're a housing person. We don't want to meet with you. I'm like, no, really, like I really want to meet the Ministry of Finance. And whenever I sit down with the Ministry of Finance, and they always give me like 22 minutes, I ask them, exactly how does the financialization of housing benefit your economy? How does it benefit? Now, I'm not talking about, I moved to the city of Ottawa and I need a place to live and I buy a house. That's not what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about when units are leveraged and used to create other financial instruments to generate more money, et cetera. The occupation of the home and the property taxes is not what this is about. This is about creating more money off of property. And the question is, where does that money go and how does it benefit the local? And I have yet to receive, hopefully maybe there's people in this room who can explain the benefit, but I have yet to receive an answer where I thought, oh yeah, that really does benefit. Because we're not talking about situations where this money is resulting in lots of new builds, right? If you take Timber Creek, it's a nice concrete example. So Timber Creek, asset management firm, huge. They swoop in to Ottawa and they see this Herongate undervalued area, right? Affordable rents. These are already built buildings. They're already built. So they swoop in and they purchase them. How does that benefit our economy? I don't think it does. Another example, you might have heard of these things called golden visas. This is, I didn't talk about it, it's another way of financializing residential real estate. So that's when, and Canada used to have a golden visa program under Prime Minister Harper. So basically what happens is investors are lured to a country because if they spend over a certain amount of money, 500,000 euros, US dollars, by purchasing residential real estate or any real estate, they can get what's called a golden visa, and then it's like a permanent resident card here. In some cases, you can, in Cyprus, for example, you can give X amount and you actually get citizenship. Okay, so it's in those. In fact, when I was in Portugal, they have a very big and vibrant. They've just expanded it, I think, golden visa program in Portugal. So I asked the finance minister there, like, how does that benefit Portugal? Like, I don't totally get it. And I mean, I think it brings cash into the country, but it doesn't circulate the cash. So I'm still looking for answers, right? Because you purchase the property. Okay, so you have property tax, but that's like not a huge amount of money, if you buy a villa or whatever. So, and then the other thing I want to just say about property tax and taxes generally, I actually am out of step with those who just say, oh, we should raise taxes on corporations or individuals of ultra high net worth. I agree that we should. That's not where I'm out of step. But I don't believe in just blanket, raise taxes. I believe in targeted taxes. Raise taxes and say X percentage of this increase in tax is going to be funneled back into very specific social goods like housing. So when I'm watching what's happening in the States with the new congresswomen, I'm in awe of them. They're amazing. But I'm rattled because, and even Bernie Sanders is doing it too. Oh, we just need to tax the rich more. Well, yes, but we need targeted taxes. I tell you, housing falls off. It's one of the fastest things to fall off as a beneficiary of monies for social goods. It's not considered a social good. It's so entrenched in the private, Unlike, if you think about it, healthcare. In this country, it's still understood mostly as a social good. It's an incomplete social good, but it's understood as a social good. Education, still considered as a social good. We have public schools, we have public hospitals, right? Housing, not so much. So.
Hi, I'm Taryn. I'm a PhD in the program. I have a couple of questions too, so feel free to take on one or both as you choose. I study youth, so that's kind of my pet project a little bit. And one of the things that I've noticed in my studies is that a very, very high portion of criminalized youth are homeless youth or youth who have unsure housing. But they also tend to get treated as something drastically different from other humans. So human rights, I'm interested to see how human rights can extend isn't quite the right word, but how where you get human rights to cover youth when they tend to fall under the rights of the child or get excluded even in that. My second question for you is regarding the some of the suggestions you had for ways that we can kind of make a difference as an individual. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded very similar to the kind of like voting with your money, kind of like choosing where you spend your money or choosing not to invest in places, which I'm curious if there's a way in which we could individually kind of usurp the system rather than buy into the kind of neoliberal system of voting with our money.
On the youth question, I mean, young people are it today. I mean, they're going to change the world. So, right? I mean, and I'm not joking. I mean, look at this country. I don't know what's going on in Canada, but around the world, it's young people who are walking out of classrooms protesting climate change. I mean, that young girl in Sweden sitting outside of the government buildings, she's galvanized. I mean, young women fighting against violence. So I think youth need to start, I agree, turning their minds to other issues and not just climate change. I think it will come. I would love to hear youth say that, they're walking out of their classrooms because of the fact that they have unaffordable housing, or they're living in a motel, or they're living in a shelter, or their friends are, or they're being faced with eviction, or they've moved 3 times in the last year because their parents can't afford the rent. I would love to see a movement around that. I'm going on an official visit to France in April as one of my, I'm doing 2 country visits this year. One is to France and one is to Nigeria. And in France, we're going to visit a school in, I think my assistant is here, Julieta, outside of Paris, in a racialized community. And I want to hear from young people about housing in that context. Because when I go into people's homes, the parents are there, and so the young people don't talk as much. But I think it has to come from youth. There are, you're right, some gaps in protections, I think. If you look at our Human Rights Code in Ontario, with respect to housing, 16 and 17-year-olds are covered, unlike the rest of the Human Rights Code. But still, it doesn't capture all youth. And I've done work with youth, and I've been depressed by that work because of a lack of sense of rights entitlement. Homeless youth saying that they kind of understand why landlords wouldn't rent to them, right? So internalized oppression, or whatever you want to call it. Your second question, voting with your money. I like that analysis. I hadn't thought that that's where I had gone with the Airbnb. I think you meant with the Airbnb example. How to usurp the system. Oh, I don't know. I'm really mainstream, if you haven't noticed. Seriously, I'm kind of mainstream in a way. I mean, people often ask me when I give these talks, are you a Marxist? Are you a socialist? And, I'm actually, I think, a capitalist. I actually believe that our capitalist system can be human rights compliant. So that's kind of what I'm on about. So if I sound that way to you, you heard me right. I'm practical, and I don't want to bring down capitalism. That's really big. I just want to change the financial system.
Not too big.
Leilani, you mentioned Finland as I presume an exception, or one of the exceptions to, And could you describe some of the principles or like how they handle things so that they don't have as big a homelessness problem as, and presumably the other Scandinavian countries don't have, although I know Sweden is starting to have that. And what is the basis of, like, is it legally, like, I don't know, you know, but what do you consider the basis of their having a lesser problem in housing rights and so on?
Yeah. That's a good question. Have I not talked about this with you, Mum? All good roads, all good social progress roads lead to Finland, except suicide rates. But no, really, they have like crazy high suicide rates. The happiest people have the highest suicide rates. Anyway. So in Finland, they do have a constitutional right to housing. And so I often am asked, well, do you think that that plays some role? And I do. I think that they have a culture in Finland where certain things are unacceptable. Julieta will remember, I think, were you with me when we were talking to the ambassador from Finland to Geneva? So we're at this cocktail party and we're talking to this ambassador, the Finnish ambassador, a woman. And I said to her, oh, you know, my next report is going to speak highly of Finland because you're the only country in Europe that has not seen an increase in homelessness, and you've actually are solving homelessness. And she said, oh, you know, I'm pleased to hear that. And then she went on to say, basically, that in Finland, it's just, most people just find it completely unacceptable that there would be homeless people on their streets. And that's a cultural thing. Whereas I think here in North America, we, you know, walking by, oh yeah, there's a homeless person, and we don't even think twice any longer about it. So I think there's a culture. I think there's a legal culture. They've also adopted a program that's called Housing First, which understands that instead of, the system in Canada, for example, is normally such that it's like, oh, there's a person who's homeless. Okay, they have a psychosocial disability and they are drug addicted. So let's get them on their psychosocial meds and let's get them off of the drugs, and then maybe we'll get them into some housing. And in Finland, the Housing First approach is entirely different. It's like, person has no home. Get them a home, and then give them all of the social supports that they need to be successful living in that home. And that might mean they need social supports for 3 months. It might mean they need social supports for the rest of their life. And in Finland, they commit to that. I've seen Housing First programs in North America where it's like a 12-month program. It completely undermines the concept of Housing First. Housing First has to go with the needs of the person for the length of time. That being said, when Finland first introduced Housing First and looked and they set themselves targets for, you know, how many people they wanted to get out of homelessness, they didn't meet the targets. They actually met the targets, but they didn't feel satisfied. They didn't feel they had done a good enough job with their first program. So they took another kick at the can. And when they took that kick, what they realized is they really needed to address the structural problems, the causes, the structural causes of homelessness, and that's where they start engaging with their economy. I'm watching Finland closely though, because I saw I was doing some research just the other day that these big private equity firms are moving into Finland and buying up properties, affordable properties. So that I'm going to keep that on my radar.
So thank you so much for your talk. It was really eye-opening. I was talking to my students this morning actually about like how many of them wanted to own a house, and of course they all raised their hand. And we talked about this idea of like the problems of affording people housing and stuff like that. So during your talk, you used a lot of language of liberty, dignity, a lot of like Section 7-esque kind of terms. And I'm not as well informed in human rights law. But if you're using these terms of Section 7-ish areas of dignity, liberty, and that kind of stuff, and supporting this right, this human right for housing, how does that relate to the Tandu Jaja decision and the fact that the Supreme Court didn't actually take it up, and the fact that there was a decision in the lower courts? And just wondering your feedback on that kind of thought process.
Hmm.
Sorry if that's a mean
I was involved in the Tanu-Jaja case. It's close to my heart. For those of you who don't know, the Tanu-Jaja case is a failed case in Canada where 5 people who had experienced different types of homelessness and gross housing inadequacy challenged the lack of a national housing strategy in this country as a violation of Section 7 of the Charter, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And the case actually wasn't decided on its merits. So that's a good thing, in a way, because it leaves open the door. The door is still open as to whether in this country the Charter and Section 7 protects people living in homelessness. I think if you ask the average Canadian, do you think the Charter should or does protect the most vulnerable people living in homelessness, they would think, oh yeah, for sure, of course it does. But as of now, there's no court decision that goes there. I do think that Section 7 should be used to protect anyone who experiences a deprivation of life, liberty, or security of the person, regardless of the cause, where government action or inaction is involved. And I think that we will see that litigation eventually come good in this country. I'm hopeful, hopefully in my lifetime. We're seeing it in other countries. There's some beautiful decisions out of India, for example, where the highest court judges, just get it because, they live in India and they can see the absolute connection between one's life and one's lack of housing or living on the streets. And, I think we need some sensitivity training of our judges because I think that what's happened is a very legalistic and mechanistic interpretation of Section 7. I think it's promulgated in law schools. I don't know about legal departments, but certainly I went to law school. It's absolute, and I see law students coming out. That's part of why I was thinking it would be cool if law profs became part of the shift, because I think we have to start educating differently. Yeah, is that enough? Yeah. Yeah. I wrote a report, actually. One of my reports was on the right to life and the right to housing. So it's no surprise that I would think Section 7 must go there.
One last question, Leilani.
Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm just kind of wondering, in terms of your approach to different countries, how do you deal with the dynamics of the different countries? For instance, you mentioned you're going to Nigeria. I'm Nigerian. From a realist point of view, housing is not a human right. Why? People can't even feed. So you're talking of housing. Secondly, culturally, we have a strong family system. So in terms of housing, I think the average Nigerian is desensitized because issues like, food, water, you can't even have that, then you're talking of housing. And then secondly, your speech, which is quite interesting, assumes that the government is responsible. So when you get to countries where the government is really not interested in the people and it's a case of every man for himself, how exactly do you handle such situations?
I'm bringing you with me on my next mission. So one of the things I didn't talk about, because this wasn't this is real legal thing, but the way the right to housing works is at the, international level is you apply it in each specific country based on the very specific context that you're working in. And one of the key elements is the resource base of the country. So, for example, that's why I kept saying, we live in the 10th richest country in the world. Our GDP is, because Canada will be judged from a human rights point of view based on the availability of resources that it could harness. Not the resources it is harnessing, but just the resources it could harness to actually implement the right to housing. So when I go to a place like Nigeria, or I went to Egypt, which is another intransigent, in some ways, country. Don't tweet that, please, because I'm up against it with Egypt at the moment. And I'm serious, don't tweet that, please. I look at the resource base of the country. So when I go to Nigeria, I'll do a whole analysis of how robust is the economy, what's the economic growth projected, where are they sinking money, where aren't they sinking money, that kind of thing. One of the things that's so interesting about Nigeria is, you say, and I take your point, I have a long fascination for Nigeria, and I've worked with Nigerians for a really long time. And there's no doubt that there's huge deprivation in Nigeria, in Lagos, the largest African city. But you also have one of the most vibrant right-to-housing movements in the world. So it's very interesting. So so there's several groups that I've worked with. Just Empower is one, Just Empower, and the Social and Economic Rights Action Center, and there was one more and I can't remember its name. And they've really, it's amazing, mobilized huge communities, mainly on the issue of evictions. Because evictions are happening in Nigeria all the time, making way for luxury. One of the evictions that I got involved in as a rapporteur involved the eviction of 30,000 people to make way for a luxury shopping mall and luxury residences on the waterfront property. Not all 30,000 people have been evicted, but that's what's slated. But there's a very vibrant movement there, and you have in Nigeria very good courts and very good laws protecting the right to housing, and even some good judgments. So sometimes the evictions are, what's that called? You get an injunction. You can get an injunction in Nigerian Lagos court to stop an eviction. The problem is governments don't always listen to what the courts say. So it's an ongoing problem. One of the things we always recommend is that courts remain seized of a matter once they've made their decision, so that they ensure that governments actually implement the decision. So you don't just write the judgment and say, okay, government, go off. You say, okay, here's the judgment. They do this in South Africa, and one of the most progressive courts. Here's the judgment, and we're going to check back with you in 3 months, and then we're going to check back with you in 6 months, and then we're going to check back with you in a year. So the courts keep apprised of the issue.
I'm going to call it to an end now because people keep coming and taking away our food, and you've all been so patient. I want you to get some food. Leilani, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk and discussion that weaved together financialization of housing, human rights, law, social work, what we can do on the ground, what we can do in the courts, and what we can try and change ourselves, but also together. Hopefully there is a prof here somewhere who will help out. But please join me in thanking our Chet Mitchell lecturer.
Thank you.